It started with a sound, subtle, almost easy to dismiss. The kind of sound you could mistake for the house settling, or maybe a branch brushing against the roof. But there were no trees near my window, no branches long enough to reach above my bedroom ceiling. The first night it began, I remember lying there in the dark, half awake, with my body caught in that strange state between sleep and awareness. The air in my room felt heavier than usual. It wasn't cold, not exactly, but the kind of still air that carries the faint scent of dust and wood, like an attic that hadn't been opened in years. I was staring at the ceiling, tracing the faint outlines of light from the street lamp outside, when I heard it. A slow, deliberate scratching sound. It came from directly above me. At first, it was faint, something like the noise of a small animal. I thought maybe it was a mouse, or even a bird that had somehow gotten into the crawl space above the ceiling. The sound would start and stop, unpredictable, as if whatever it was knew when I was listening. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was nothing. Houses make noises, I told myself, especially old ones like mine. But after a few minutes, it changed. It became rhythmic. Scratch, pause, scratch, scratch, pause. Each movement seemed to drag longer than it should, like claws catching against the wood beams. And it wasn't coming from a distant corner of the ceiling. It was centered, right above my bed. I remember lying there, my eyes open, barely breathing, listening. Every small noise in the house seemed amplified. The ticking of the wall clock, the faint hum of the refrigerator downstairs, even my heartbeat pounding against my ribs. The scratching continued for what felt like hours, always stopping when I dared to move or shift in the sheets. When I finally drifted off, it was only because exhaustion pulled me under. The next morning, the ceiling looked perfectly normal. No marks, no holes, no signs of damage. But the sound had left a faint unease in my stomach. It lingered with me all day, that gnawing feeling that something had been right above me while I slept. When night came again, I turned in early, telling myself it was nothing more than a rodent problem. I even brought a flashlight to check the attic access, but the hatch in the hallway ceiling was stiff and dust-covered, as if it hadn't been opened in years. I decided I'd call someone to look at it in the morning. That was the second night. I fell asleep sometime past midnight, my body tense but tired. The street outside was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes every little sound inside feel sharper. Around 2 in the morning, I woke up again. No reason, just that sudden alert feeling, like my body knew before my mind did that something wasn't right. The sound was back, this time louder. Scratch, scratch, drag. A slow dragging noise, like something being pulled across the wood. It didn't sound like an animal anymore. There was weight to it, a slow, deliberate motion that seemed to crawl along the ceiling, tracing the length of my bed. I stared up into the dark, frozen. My mind raced to rationalize it. Rats, maybe a raccoon, but none of those would sound like this. None of them moved that slowly, that intentionally. I could almost feel the vibration of the scratching through the air, faint but distinct, like the ceiling itself was breathing. The sound moved. It traveled from one end of the room to the other, then back again. And then it stopped directly above me. I don't know how long I lay there, eyes wide open, every muscle locked. I didn't move, didn't blink. The silence that followed was somehow worse. A deep, suffocating quiet that made me wish the sound would start again, just so I'd know it was still there. When I finally turned on the bedside lamp, the ceiling looked the same as before, flat, clean, pale. But I could have sworn the air smelled faintly of something burned. By morning, the smell was gone. But I barely slept. I didn't tell anyone. It sounded ridiculous, even to me. 3 scratches above my bed, so what? Maybe I was imagining it. Maybe I was just overtired. But that night, the third night, something changed. It didn't start right away. The hours ticked by without incident, and for a while, I thought maybe it had stopped for good. I remember lying there, eyes heavy, finally feeling a little peace when I heard it again. Only this time, it wasn't just scratching. It was tapping. Soft, irregular taps, like fingernails on hollow wood. I could hear them tracing the outline of my ceiling, slow and curious, stopping right where my head rested on the pillow. Each tap echoed faintly through the room, and I could almost imagine a shape above me, crouched low, its fingers pressed against the plaster. Then came the sound of breathing. I'm certain of it now. It wasn't the wind or the pipes or anything that could be explained away. It was steady, uneven breathing, raspy and shallow, like someone struggling to draw air through a dry throat. It came from the same spot as the scratching, and I could feel the faintest tremor of vibration through the ceiling as it exhaled. I wanted to move, to grab my phone, to run, but something about the air felt wrong, heavy and thick, like it was holding me in place. My chest tightened. The air smelled different now, too. Damp, earthy, like soil after rain, mixed with something metallic, something old. The sound didn't stop. It grew softer, slower, until I couldn't tell if it was still there or if my mind was replaying it. I remember staring at the ceiling until my vision blurred. The lamp flickered once, twice, and then the room went dark again. And then silence. The kind of silence that feels alive. When morning came, I left the house. I didn't go to work. I drove until I found a small diner miles away and sat there for hours, just watching people, laughing, talking, existing, everything that felt normal and distant to me now. I tried to convince myself it was over, but when I returned home that afternoon, something caught my eye. A faint line across the ceiling, just above my bed, thin but visible in the right light. The paint had cracked slightly, as if something had pressed against it from the other side. I didn't sleep there that night. I stayed in the living room with every light on, the hum of the TV drowning out the stillness of the house. I thought maybe whatever it was would lose interest if I ignored it, but at around 3 a.m., even through the static and the flickering screen, I heard it again. A distant scratching, not above the bed this time, above the living room, right above where I sat. It didn't stop until sunrise. I called pest control that morning. They checked the attic, the vents, the crawl space, every corner of the roof. Nothing. No droppings, no signs of infestation, no holes or nests. The insulation was untouched. The man looked at me, puzzled, said the house was cleaner than most. But he was wrong, because that night, when I tried to sleep again in the bedroom, the scratching started again. Faint, slow, patient, like it knew I had come back, like it was waiting for me. I can still hear it sometimes when the house gets quiet enough. Not every night, but often enough that I can't forget it. Always the same rhythm. Scratch, pause, scratch, scratch, pause. Sometimes it moves to different rooms. Sometimes it comes from the walls instead of the ceiling. But it's always there. And every time I hear it, I can't shake the feeling that it isn't trying to get out of the ceiling. It's trying to get through. I used to think old houses breathed, the slow creak of wooden floors expanding under the shift of midnight air, the sigh that came when the wind pressed against the eaves. It all felt alive in a strange, comforting way. When I moved into that small rental house on the outskirts of town, I expected it to make noise. It was built sometime in the 1950s, with warped door frames, yellowed wallpaper, and a ceiling that bowed ever so slightly in the middle of the living room. The kind of place that seemed to hum with age. I didn't mind that. I liked quiet, and I liked being alone. But that first night, the house didn't sound like it was breathing. It sounded like it was moving. It started after midnight. I'd gone to bed around 11, still half awake from scrolling through my phone, the screen's light fading as my eyelids grew heavy. The air felt heavy too, thick and stale, as if the walls were holding their breath. I remember thinking that the ceiling above my bed looked lower than it did during the day, like it was sagging just a little. I dismissed it. Shadows do strange things in the dark. Then came the sound. It wasn't loud, not at first. Just a faint, dry scuffling, like sandpaper being dragged over wood. It came from directly above my head, a soft, irregular rhythm. Scratch. Pause. Scratch, scratch. Silence. I froze, listening. The house had no attic, just a narrow crawl space above the plaster ceiling. It could have been a mouse, or maybe a raccoon nesting between the beams. I told myself that, again and again, until the sound shifted. The scuffling became heavier. Slow, deliberate movement. Whatever it wasn't small. It crawled, not scurried. The wood creaked under its weight, and I could trace its path by the groaning of the ceiling boards. It moved from one side of the room to the other, stopping directly above where I lay. The air seemed to thicken around me. I held my breath, counting the seconds. 5, 10, 15. Nothing. Then, one long drag of something rough across the ceiling, like claws. My heart thudded so hard I could feel it in my throat. Every instinct told me not to move. I remember how cold the room felt then, unnaturally cold, like the air had been sucked out and replaced with something stale, almost metallic. The faint smell of old would mingled with something else. Something damp, mildewy, like wet hair that hadn't dried right. When I finally gathered the courage to turn on the bedside lamp, the yellow light cut through the dark like a knife. The ceiling was still. Cracked paint. Faint discoloration where water had leaked once, years ago. No movement. Nothing. I sat there listening, my ears straining so hard they buzzed. After a while, the noise stopped completely, and all that remained was the whisper of the night wind pressing against the old glass windows. Eventually, I lay back down, telling myself it was just an animal. Just a sound. Just the house. The next day, I asked the landlord about the crawl space. He told me it was sealed, no access from the inside. Just insulation and wood beams between the ceiling and roof. Nothing up there, he said. Maybe a bird got stuck. He didn't seem concerned. I wanted to believe him. The second night was worse. It began later, closer to 2 a.m. I woke to the sound of movement again, heavier this time. A dragging shuffle, slow and deliberate. It crossed the length of the ceiling, stopped, and then a thump. Not hard, but solid, like something large had dropped to its knees above me. I could hear it shifting its weight, the wood groaning quietly under each shift. The rhythm of it was strange, too controlled to be random. Almost curious, like it was listening. I couldn't see anything through the plaster, but I could feel where it was. The pressure, the faint vibration of wood. The sensation crawled through my skin. I reached for my lamp again, hand shaking, but before my fingers brushed the switch, I heard it breathe. Faint but real. A soft exhale pressed through the wood, as though something enormous and warm was just inches above my face. It wasn't animal. It wasn't human either. It was too steady, too deep. My body went rigid. I didn't move for the rest of the night. The sound eventually faded, replaced by silence so complete it hurt my ears. In the morning, I noticed something strange. A faint line of dust had fallen from the ceiling onto my bedsheet, fine, pale gray powder. I ran my fingers through it. It smelled faintly of earth. When I looked up, there was a crack in the plaster, small but new, directly above where I slept. The paint around it seemed darker, as if damp. I should have called someone. I should have left. But exhaustion and denial are powerful things. You can convince yourself of almost anything if it means not admitting fear. By the third night, I didn't bother trying to sleep early. I stayed up, sitting in bed with a flashlight, staring at that crack in the ceiling. The house was silent except for the distant hum of the refrigerator. Midnight came, then 1 o'clock, then 2, and then it began again. Not a scratch this time, not a crawl. It was a dragging sound, heavier than before, like something was being pulled across the wooden beams. The ceiling trembled faintly with each movement. The crack widened slightly, releasing another faint sprinkle of dust that landed on my blanket. I could hear it clearer now, each subtle groan and creak of the wood. The thing above me was large, impossibly large for such a narrow crawl space. The movement stopped above my bed again, exactly where it always did. I tilted the flashlight up. The beam trembled against the cracked paint. That's when I saw it, the faintest distortion in the surface. A slight bulge, like the ceiling was swelling outward. It pulsed once, softly, as if something behind it was pressing gently against the plaster. I couldn't breathe. My fingers tightened around the flashlight. Another bulge formed beside it, lower this time. 2 shapes, round, aligned, like eyes. The light flickered. My hand was shaking so violently the beam danced across the ceiling. The shapes didn't move, but the air changed again, that thick, damp, almost organic smell filling the room. The ceiling creaked, and then a sound like nails dragging slowly across wood. Right above my head. The sound continued for what felt like forever, tracing small, deliberate circles. The bulges pulsed again, and I could swear, I heard that faint, steady breathing return. Close. Too close. When the light finally went out, I didn't move. I lay perfectly still, flashlight dead in my hand, staring up into the dark. Every part of my body was screaming to run, but I couldn't. I was frozen. The weight of silence pressed down like a hand. Then the faintest sound. A crack. Not from above, but from inside the wall beside my bed. A slow, soft tapping. Like something had found another way in. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't sleep the night after either. By the next morning, there were fine streaks of brownish dust along the edges of the ceiling. The crack had widened further, spreading like a vein across the plaster. I packed my things and left before the sun went down. I didn't tell the landlord why. I didn't even care about the deposit. I just needed to get out. That was months ago. I moved to a small apartment in the city, newer, cleaner, quieter. But sometimes, when I'm lying awake late at night, I swear I can still hear it. That slow, crawling shuffle in the ceiling, faint, distant, as if it followed me somehow. The smell of damp wood will hit me, just for a second, and I'll glance up at the white ceiling above my bed, always expecting to see it. That bulge, that faint pulse, the sound of something breathing where no air should move. I tell myself it's just memory, just paranoia. But sometimes, when I turn off the light and the silence stretches too long, I'll hear it again. Scratch. Pause. Scratch, scratch. And then stillness, as if it's waiting, just above me. I never thought much about the ceiling in my apartment. It was one of those old drop ceilings, the kind with stained white tiles that looked like they could crumble if you stared too hard at them. The building itself was decades old, maybe from the late 60s, and my unit had the scent of long-forgotten tenants buried somewhere in the walls. You could always smell something faintly musty, like wet drywall and cigarette smoke, no matter how much air freshener you used. It started with noises, small, barely noticeable at first. A faint scuffling sound, just above my bed. I thought it was rats, or maybe a squirrel that had found its way into the roof space. It happened mostly at night, when everything else went quiet. I'd lie in bed, staring up at the grid of ceiling tiles, trying to follow the sound. It wasn't constant. Sometimes days went by without anything. Other nights, it came back stronger. At first, it was a kind of scratching. Light, uncertain, like nails but slower. Then a pause. Then another faint drag. Something was moving just above the thin sheet of tile separating me from the empty dark above. The landlord didn't care when I mentioned it. He said old buildings make noises. Pipes, wood expanding, animals nesting. I wanted to believe him. I really did. Because the alternative was that something alive was up there, something that seemed to move only when I was home. By the third week, I started to notice small things out of place. My ceiling dust would fall in tiny gray specks onto the carpet under the vent. A sour smell began to drift through the air, something between damp mold and rotting meat. I'd clean it, spray disinfectant, and pretend it was nothing. But every night, when I turned off the lights and lay in the dark, I'd hear it again. The scratching, then dragging, then silence. One night, I decided to record it. I left my phone on the nightstand, the microphone pointed toward the ceiling, and pressed record before trying to sleep. I didn't last long. The sound came again, faint at first, then louder, right above me. I stayed frozen under the blanket, staring up. The tile above the corner of my bed looked like it was shifting. Just a tiny tremor, but enough for me to see the edge of it move, as if something heavy had brushed past it from above. When I played back the audio the next morning, I heard something I hadn't noticed in the moment. The scratching was there, yes, but underneath it, faintly, there was a rhythm, a breathing sound. Slow, shallow breaths, timed with the pauses between movements. That's when the fear turned into something else, a kind of awareness. Like the space above my ceiling was no longer just part of the building, it had become something separate, a hidden layer that watched me while I slept. I stopped sleeping in the bedroom after that. I moved to the couch in the living room. But the sounds followed. The scratching came from a different direction, traveling above me through the ceiling panels, like something crawling just out of sight. It was heavier now, slower, deliberate. I started noticing the temperature changes too. Sometimes the air would feel cold in specific spots, like a pocket of dead air had opened above. Other times, the faint smell of something metallic, like rust or dried blood, would seep down from the vents. Days passed in a fog of exhaustion. I'd come home from work and sit in silence, listening, waiting. There were moments when the building seemed to hold its breath with me. Nothing moved. No neighbors, no sounds from the street. Just that heavy, hanging quiet. Then the night came when the tile actually fell. It happened around 2:40 a.m. I was half asleep on the couch when I heard a dull thump, followed by the faint sound of something sliding. When I turned on the lamp, I saw one of the ceiling tiles on the floor, cracked in half, coated in black dust. Above it was a square hole leading into pure darkness. For a long moment, nothing moved. I just stared at it, my throat dry, every nerve in my body ready to run. Then I heard it again, from inside the hole, a slow exhale. Not like an animal, like a person. I didn't go near it. I grabbed my keys, ran out of the apartment, and called the police from the street below. When they arrived, I expected them to tell me I was overreacting. Maybe they'd find a raccoon or a homeless person who'd somehow gotten into the vents. But the way they looked at the hole after shining a flashlight inside told me otherwise. They called for backup. 2 more officers came, then a maintenance worker to pull down more tiles. The air that poured out from above smelled rancid, like something long dead. Even the cops covered their faces. One of them climbed a small ladder and peeked inside. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he whispered something to the others, and they all froze. I couldn't see what they saw, but I heard the sound when they pulled it down. A hollow thud, then a heavier one, like a sack hitting the floor. The smell got worse, much worse. They made me step outside. I stood in the hallway, shaking, while they moved around inside my apartment. The corridor lights flickered slightly, buzzing in the stale air. I remember every small detail: the texture of the paint on the wall, the faint hum of the elevator, the smell of floor polish mixed with decay coming from my open door. When they finally led me back in, one of the officers looked pale. He didn't say much, just that something had been living above my ceiling. What they pulled down wasn't an animal. It was a sleeping bag, dark and filthy, with food wrappers, bottles, and blankets stuffed into the space above the tiles. Inside that bag was the decomposed body of a man. Judging by how long he'd been there, they said he must have been living above me for weeks, maybe months, before dying. They told me his clothes were tattered, and he had clawed marks on his hands, like he'd tried to push the tiles open before he died. The officers found more evidence of him moving around up there: footprints in the dust, scraps of food, even a small flashlight with dead batteries. The space above my apartment connected to others through narrow crawlways, just wide enough for a man to crawl through. They said I was lucky the tile broke when it did. Otherwise, I might never have known he was there. For days after, I couldn't bring myself to step inside that apartment again. Even after they cleaned everything, replaced the ceiling, repainted, I could still feel the weight of it. That knowledge, that someone had been lying above me, watching me, breathing quietly while I slept below. Sometimes late at night, I think about the sound I heard on the recording, that slow, steady breathing that didn't belong to me. I think about the way the dust used to fall in tiny specks, drifting down through the thin gap between the tiles, landing softly on my bedspread. I think about how long he must have watched me unseen, in that cramped darkness above. And every now and then, when the house I live in now goes still, I swear I can hear it again. A faint drag, a slow, muffled breath, and the softest, most patient sound of something shifting above me, just behind the ceiling tiles. It started with the sound of scratching, soft, inconsistent, just above the ceiling where my bed pressed up against the wall. The house was old, wooden beams swollen from years of humidity, plaster yellowed from cigarette smoke of previous tenants, and a faint smell of dust and mildew that never seemed to fade no matter how many air fresheners I hung. I rented it because it was cheap and because it was quiet. At least, that's what I thought when I moved in. The first night, I brushed off the noise as rats. This neighborhood was full of them. The landlord had warned me casually, almost like a joke. "You'll hear them in the walls sometimes," he'd said. "Don't worry, they never come down." But they did, or at least something did. It began in the corner above my closet, right where the ceiling panels sagged slightly from age. The sound came in irregular bursts, a faint scuffle, like claws dragging lightly across wood. It wasn't loud enough to be alarming, but it was persistent. I could hear it even through my headphones, faintly between songs. Sometimes it would stop when I looked up, like whatever was up there knew I was listening. For a week, it went on like that. Little sounds at night. Scratching. Tapping. Occasionally a dull thud, as if something heavy had shifted its weight just above the plaster. I'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself it was just rodents. Maybe raccoons. Maybe something nesting. Then came the smell. It drifted down one night around 2 a.m., faint at first, then heavier, thicker, like damp earth mixed with something sour. It had that wet, organic edge, like rotting leaves after rain. I thought maybe something had died up there. Maybe one of the rats had crawled into the insulation and couldn't find its way out. I tried to ignore it. I even told myself it was normal for an old house. But there was something about that smell that unsettled me in a way I couldn't describe. It wasn't just decay. It was sweet underneath, like old perfume, and it lingered even after I sprayed the air freshener. I could feel it clinging to my hair, my clothes. By the second week, I started to notice something else. The scratching wasn't random anymore. It followed a pattern, 3 slow drags, a pause, then 2 shorter ones. Sometimes it repeated over and over, as if testing how long I'd stay awake to hear it. I started sleeping on the couch. The living room felt safer somehow. It was smaller, more contained, and I could keep the lights on without feeling exposed. The smell didn't reach there, and the ceiling was lower, cleaner. Still, every now and then, I thought I could hear faint movement in the air vents. I remember one night, the kind of night where the air feels heavy, pressing down on your skin like a wet blanket. I was half asleep on the couch, the TV buzzing faintly in the background, when I heard something move directly above me. Not a scuffle this time. Not a scratch. A crawl. It was slow, deliberate. Something dragging itself across the beams, weight shifting with every movement. I held my breath and listened. It stopped right above the living room light fixture. The sound of wood creaking under pressure made the hairs on my arms rise. Then silence. I waited for a long time, too afraid to move. Eventually, I convinced myself it was just my imagination, turned off the TV, and went back to the bedroom. That's when I realized the smell was stronger there. Much stronger, like something had been festering directly above the ceiling panels. I remember standing in the middle of the room, staring up, feeling that thick, heavy air press against my face. I thought I could hear something faint behind the walls, not scratching this time, but a soft, steady breath. I left the light on that night. When morning came, I called an exterminator. He showed up later that day, a short man with weathered hands and eyes that didn't seem to care much about anything. He climbed up into the attic, moved around for maybe 10 minutes, then came back down shaking his head. "No rats," he said. "No nests. Nothing living up there." I asked about the smell. He shrugged. "Old houses trap odors. Could be mold. Could be insulation. I'll spray something to cover it up." He left me a can of deodorizer and told me to keep my vents open. That night, the scratching came back. Louder this time. More agitated. It sounded angry. The pattern was different now, faster, almost rhythmic. Like something pacing back and forth. I pressed my palm to the wall, and I swear I could feel faint vibrations beneath the plaster. Whatever was up there was real. I could feel it moving. At some point, I started recording the sounds on my phone. When I played them back, though, the scratching didn't sound like claws anymore. It sounded like something trying to form words. Soft, wet, breathy. I listened with headphones, straining to make sense of it. The noise warped through the static, dragging consonants, muffled syllables. Then, just before the clip ended, I heard something that froze me completely. It said my name. Not clearly, but enough that I couldn't deny it. A low whisper, drawn out, almost sighing. I dropped the phone and just sat there, staring at the ceiling, waiting for it to happen again. But the house was silent. Completely silent. I didn't sleep that night. By morning, I felt sick. The smell was unbearable. I tried opening the windows, lighting candles, even sleeping in the car. But the whispering wouldn't stop. It came in the late hours, between 2 and 4 in the morning, when everything else was still. Sometimes it came from the vents. Sometimes from the walls. Sometimes right above the bed, a faint breath in the dark. Always my name. I stopped recording after that. There was no point. I knew what I'd heard. One evening, after a storm, part of the ceiling above the closet sagged lower than usual. The plaster looked damp, the paint bubbling like something underneath was pushing through. I took a broom and tapped it lightly. A dark, wet stain spread across the surface. Then the sound, not scratching this time, but something falling, something heavy collapsing into the insulation. I grabbed a chair, climbed up, and pried the ceiling panel open just enough to peek inside. The air that came out was cold and foul, like wet soil mixed with something rotten. My flashlight beam caught movement. Not an animal, not something alive, but hair. Human hair. Tangled around insulation, matted and pale, stretching across the beam. I froze. My mind couldn't process it at first. It was just there, half hidden under dust and cobwebs. I pulled back before I could see more. The whisper came almost immediately, from directly behind the wall. "Close. Too close. It said my name again, clearer this time, like someone standing inches from my ear. I stumbled back, dropped the flashlight, and fell off the chair. When the light rolled across the floor, I saw dust falling from the ceiling, tiny fragments of plaster drifting down like snow. Then came the dragging sound. Slow, heavy, something moving toward the open gap. I ran. I didn't pack anything. I didn't even lock the door. I just grabbed my keys and drove. I don't remember how far I went, maybe 2-3 towns away, until the adrenaline wore off and I had to stop. For a while, I tried to tell myself it was all in my head. Stress, sleep deprivation. Maybe I'd hallucinated the whisper. Maybe I'd imagined the hair. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. A few weeks later, I got a call from the landlord. He said the ceiling in my old room had collapsed during a storm. The police had been called because a neighbor smelled something awful. They found what was left of a woman's body. It had been there for years, sealed between the beams and insulation. They said the previous tenant's wife had gone missing, but no one had ever looked up there. The body was decomposed beyond recognition. But her hair, he said it was long, pale. I hung up before he could say more. That night, I stayed at a motel off the highway. The walls were thin, the air stale. But I felt safer there, at least for a little while. Until I woke up around 3 in the morning and heard something faint coming from the vent above the bed. A slow, dragging sound, followed by a whisper. My name. It started the night after Mr. Delaney died. The old man had lived alone in the house next to mine for as long as I'd been here. His curtains were always drawn, his lawn left half-tended, and sometimes, on still nights, I could hear his radio humming softly through the wall. It was one of those older duplexes, 2 separate homes sharing one thin wall, built sometime in the 60s, when soundproofing was apparently optional. I'd gotten used to the faint shuffle of his footsteps, the dragging sound of his slippers, the occasional tapping of a cane against the floor. They were background noises, comforting even, the kind that reminded you someone else was nearby. But when the paramedics came that morning, everything went quiet. They carried him out on a stretcher, covered in a pale blue sheet. I remember standing by my window, watching as the body was loaded into the ambulance. The air was still. Not even the wind moved the old birch tree between our driveways. When they drove away, it left behind a silence that felt heavier than I expected. A silence that didn't belong. That night, the scratching began. It was faint at first. A slow, uneven drag, like fingernails lightly tracing along drywall. I heard it around midnight, coming from the wall we used to share. I was lying in bed, reading on my phone, and I paused when I caught it. The sound seemed to move, traveling from one end of the wall to the other, soft, deliberate. Not the sharp skitter of a mouse or the rustle of an insect. Something slower, human almost. I told myself it was just the house settling. Old wood, old pipes. Houses make sounds when they're empty. That's what I wanted to believe. But the sound came again the next night. Same time. Only this time it was louder. I turned off my lamp and listened. It was unmistakable, scraping from inside the wall, following the line where our bedrooms met. I could almost picture it, fingers pressing against plaster from the other side, dragging down slowly, like something searching for a way through. I held my breath, waiting for it to stop. It didn't. It went on for several minutes, pausing occasionally, as if whoever, or whatever, was making it was listening back. When it finally ended, I noticed something I hadn't before. A faint smell. It was subtle at first. A damp, metallic odor that seeped into the air around my bed. Not rot exactly, but something stale. Wet plaster, maybe. Or rusted pipes. I opened my window to let in the night air, but even the wind that drifted through carried that strange, faint scent. By morning, I convinced myself it had been my imagination. Grief does strange things to people, even when it isn't your grief to carry. I made coffee, went about my day, and tried not to think about the fact that, through the wall, everything in Mr. Delaney's house was still exactly as he'd left it. His relatives hadn't shown up yet. The lights stayed off. The curtains stayed closed. But that night, the scratches returned. This time they started earlier, around 10. Louder, slower, more deliberate. I could hear the pattern of movement, like something pacing behind the drywall. The sound crawled from the top corner of the wall to the floor, then across the baseboards, then up again. It reminded me of someone tracing the shape of the room from the inside. And every few seconds, it would stop, and I could almost feel the stillness pressing against me, as if it knew I was listening. I left my room that night and tried to sleep on the couch. But the sound followed. The duplex walls ran through every major room, bedroom, living area, kitchen. And no matter where I moved, the scratching would start again a few minutes later, faint but there. Sometimes above me in the ceiling, sometimes in the walls near the floor. It was as though something was moving inside the structure itself. By the fourth night, I stopped trying to explain it. The smell had grown stronger, thick, musty, like wet earth mixed with iron. It clung to the walls, to my sheets, even to my clothes. And the scratching no longer came from one place. It surrounded me. Behind the refrigerator, under the floorboards near the hall, above the ceiling fan. Always slow, always methodical, never rushed. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I went next door the next morning. The house was still sealed, police tape stretched across the front door. But there was a window near the back that wasn't fully latched. I remember the sound it made when I pushed it open. A soft crack, followed by a stale gust of air that hit me like a wall. The smell inside was worse. Thick, heavy, the kind that stuck to your tongue. Dust floated in the narrow rays of sunlight breaking through the blinds. Everything inside looked undisturbed. The newspaper still on the table, a cup half full of water on the counter, slippers neatly placed by the recliner. It was as if he'd just stepped out for a moment and never returned. I walked through the living room, past the small hallway, into his bedroom, the one that shared the wall with mine. That's when I saw it. The wall on his side wasn't like mine. The paint had peeled away in several places, and beneath it, deep grooves cut across the plaster. Long, uneven scratches. Some ran vertically, others in wide arcs, overlapping each other. The marks were too erratic to be from furniture, too deliberate to be from rodents. They looked like fingernail gouges, pressed hard enough to crumble the surface. I stepped closer and ran my hand over them. The plaster was cool, gritty beneath my fingers. In the silence, I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator somewhere in the back of the house. And then, beneath it, a low, dragging sound. It was behind the wall. Again, I stepped back slowly. The scratching was soft but steady, moving downward. Then it stopped, right where my hand had been. I froze. The air felt heavier, colder, as if the house itself had taken a breath and was holding it. And in that silence, I realized something else. The smell wasn't just must. It was decay. Old, sweet, clinging decay that had soaked into the drywall. I left immediately. Didn't even bother closing the window. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat up on my couch, lights on, staring at the wall that separated me from that room. Around 2 a.m., the scratching came again. Louder now. Closer. I could hear it travel along the inside of the wall until it stopped directly opposite where I was sitting. I tried not to move, not to breathe too loud. My skin prickled, the hairs on my arms standing up as the sound began to change. Less scratching now, more like a dull thud, repeated in uneven intervals, as though something was pressing from inside, testing the barrier. Then came a sound that turned my stomach. A slow, dragging breath. Not mechanical. Not the wind. A wet, rasping inhale that seemed to come from within the wall itself. And beneath it, faintly, something almost like a voice. Not words exactly, just the cadence of them. A rhythm, a broken whisper. I turned up the TV and left it running until morning. Days passed like that, me avoiding home as much as possible, returning only when exhaustion forced me to. I tried staying with a friend once, but even there, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing it in my head, the scratching, the dragging breath, the faint hiss of air through something that shouldn't breathe. On the 6th night, everything stopped. No sounds, no smell, just silence. It should have been a relief. But the quiet was worse. It wasn't normal silence. It was thick, heavy, the kind that presses on your eardrums until you start to hear your own pulse. I kept glancing toward the wall, waiting. I don't know how long I sat like that before I noticed it. The faint bulge in the paint near the corner. Subtle, but there, like the wall was swelling outward. The surface cracked slightly, a thin line splitting down toward the baseboard. Then another, and another. A faint sound followed, like something wet shifting behind the plaster, pushing forward. The cracks deepened, spreading in jagged lines. Dust fell in thin streams, coating the floor. My body refused to move. Every instinct screamed to run, but I couldn't. I just stood there, staring, waiting for whatever was inside to finally show itself. Then it stopped. The cracks remained, but the movement ceased. The house went utterly still. The only thing I could hear was my own heartbeat hammering in my ears. I don't remember deciding to move. One moment I was frozen, The next, I was outside, standing in my driveway, shaking. The wind was cold against my face, but it felt clean, free from that heavy, stale air inside. I didn't go back in until sunrise. The cracks were still there, but the bulge had flattened. The wall looked normal almost, as if nothing had ever happened. The smell was gone. No scratching, no breathing, just emptiness. That was 3 months ago. The house next door was sold last week. A young couple moved in, excited, full of plans to renovate. I didn't say much, just helped them carry boxes and smiled when they thanked me. They seemed happy, the kind of happy that doesn't last long in a place like that. Last night, I woke up around midnight to a familiar sound. A faint, deliberate scrape, traveling along the wall behind my bed. Slow, patient, almost gentle. It stopped just as I turned to look at it. The silence afterward felt like someone waiting, listening, remembering. And then from the other side of the wall, so soft I almost thought I imagined it, a dragging breath, and the sound of nails tracing slowly down the plaster. The scratches had started again. But this time, it wasn't my wall they were coming from. It was theirs. The apartment wasn't much. Peeling wallpaper, warped wooden floors, a constant hum of old wiring in the walls. It was cheap though. Too cheap, maybe. When I first moved in, the air smelled of dust and something faintly metallic, like rusted pipes that had been bleeding for years. The ceilings were low enough that I could almost reach up and brush my fingertips against them. It felt compressed, as if the whole place was just a little too small for the world it existed in. But I didn't think much of it at first. The landlord had mentioned something about an old crawl space running along the length of the building. Maintenance access, he said. Nothing you need to worry about. But the way his voice trailed off when he said it stuck with me. Like even he didn't believe his own words. The entrance was a small, square panel above the hallway closet. A faded piece of wood with 4 rusted screws holding it up. It wasn't supposed to open from inside the apartment, but sometimes, when the building settled, I'd hear a soft creak from up there, like wood shifting against wood. And then one night, I heard something else. It started as a faint scuffling sound, barely audible over the hum of my refrigerator. Something light, something small, like fingernails brushing against old insulation. I tried to convince myself it was rats. The building was old, of course there'd be rats. But the sound didn't move the way rats move. It didn't dart or skitter. It dragged, slowly, methodically. That night, I barely slept. Every time my eyes started to close, a new noise echoed above me, soft, deliberate movements that stopped the moment I turned off the fan and listened. Then silence. Then a long, drawn-out creak, as if something was shifting its weight directly above my bed. By morning, the sound was gone. I remember standing there, staring up at the ceiling. The plaster had faint hairline cracks running through it, like veins spreading from an unseen heart. Dust clung to the corners where the ceiling met the walls, and when the sunlight hit just right, I could see faint specks floating in the air. I could smell something, too faint, musty, like wet wood that had been sitting in the dark for too long. Days passed, then a week. The sounds would come and go, always at night, always from the same spot. Sometimes it sounded like something crawling, other times like something breathing, slow, heavy breaths that vibrated through the walls. I started leaving lights on, just small ones, a lamp in the corner, a night light in the hall. I told myself it was just for comfort, but the truth was I didn't like the dark anymore. It wasn't just noise anymore. The air felt different, heavier. There were moments when I'd come home and swear the smell had changed, stronger, more sour, like damp earth and something decaying underneath it. Once, I even thought I heard a faint drip, like water leaking from somewhere above. But when I checked, there was nothing. The ceiling was dry. It wasn't until the second month that I noticed the panel above the closet. It was slightly open, not enough to fall, just enough that I could see a thin black line where the wood had separated from the frame. I could have sworn it was flush with the ceiling before. I stood there for a long time, staring up, waiting for something, a sound, a movement, anything, but there was nothing. Just silence. I thought about calling the landlord, but how would that sound? Something's living in your crawl space. He'd probably laugh. So I tried to ignore it. For a while it worked. Then one night, I woke up to a noise that was different. A deep, hollow thump. Then another. Then a dragging sound, slow and uneven, coming from directly above the hallway. I remember sitting up, heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The air in the apartment felt wrong, still but tense, like the room was holding its breath with me. The thumping stopped, but then faintly something shifted. Wood flexed, dust trickled down from the ceiling, and then a low sound, a sort of wheeze. Wet, raspy, like air being forced through something that shouldn't be breathing. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the ceiling, waiting for daylight to make it all make sense. When the sun finally came, I could see where the ceiling had bowed ever so slightly. Not enough to collapse, but enough that it didn't look the same as before. I pushed a chair under the closet and climbed up, trying to get a closer look at the panel. My hands trembled as I reached out. The wood was cold. My fingertips brushed against the edge, and I swear I felt something on the other side move. I pulled back so fast I nearly fell off the chair. That night, I slept with every light in the apartment on. Days turned to weeks, and the sounds continued. Sometimes faint, sometimes violent, like something was clawing at the beams, trying to make space for itself. And then one morning, I found something new. In the corner of the hallway, right beneath the crawl space panel, was a small pile of dust and debris. Mixed in with it was something that didn't belong, a single, thin strip of fabric. It was old and discolored, torn along the edge like it had been ripped off something larger. I picked it up. It felt damp, and it smelled wrong. That night, the noises changed. No more dragging, no more scratching, just that same slow, heavy breathing. Closer now. When I turned off the lights, I could hear it more clearly, each inhale deep and wet, like the sound of lungs filled with mud. I covered my ears, pressed my face into the pillow, but it didn't stop. It felt like the sound wasn't in the ceiling anymore. It was in the walls. By the next morning, I'd made up my mind. I had to see what was up there. I borrowed a flashlight and unscrewed the panel. The wood groaned as I pulled it open, sending a shower of dust and insulation down into my hair. The smell hit me first, rot, mildew, and something faintly metallic. I lifted the flashlight and aimed it into the darkness. The beam cut through a haze of dust, illuminating thick cobwebs, wooden beams, and pipes running the length of the crawl space. The insulation was torn in places, shredded like something had been nesting there. And then I saw it, a shape, pale, curled up in the far corner. It didn't move, not at first. It just lay there. At first, I thought it was a bundle of old rags. But then slowly the shape shifted. Something slick reflected in the flashlight's beam, the faint glint of an eye. I froze. It was staring at me. The thing began to crawl forward, slow and deliberate. Each movement made the wood creak beneath it. Its limbs were long and thin, too thin, bending at angles that didn't seem possible. The skin was gray, mottled with dark stains. I couldn't see its face clearly, but I could hear the sound, that same wet breathing, louder now, rattling through the narrow space. I dropped the flashlight. It hit the floor, beam spinning wildly across the ceiling, throwing broken light through the darkness. By the time I grabbed it again and pointed it back up, the thing was gone. The crawl space was empty, but the smell it lingered, stronger than ever. I sealed the panel that day, screwed it shut, taped over the edges, and for a while, things were quiet again. Weeks passed. I tried to forget. I told myself I imagined it, the shape, the smell, the breathing. My mind was tired. That was all. Until one morning, I woke up and saw it again. That same strip of torn fabric. This time, lying at the foot of my bed. And when I looked up at the ceiling above me, I noticed something I hadn't before. A thin, dark stain, slowly spreading, as if something was still living up there. Something that had never left. Something that was waiting, listening. And every night since, when the lights go out, I can still hear it. The faintest sound of breath, coming from directly above. It started with a sound I couldn't place. Something faint, something alive. At first, I thought it was just the building settling. Old wood groaning, nails expanding under the warmth of the heater. The kind of sound you tell yourself to ignore, because if you listen too closely, your mind starts drawing shapes in the dark. But that night, it didn't sound like the building at all. It sounded like something in it. The ceiling in my apartment had always been a little uneven, an old, water-stained surface that sagged slightly in the middle. But that night, it seemed lower. The light from my bedside lamp caught on a new curve in the plaster, a shadowed bulge that hadn't been there before. The paint had cracked slightly around it, like something was pressing down from above, slow and deliberate. I remember staring at it for a long time, unsure if it was my imagination or some trick of the light. My apartment was quiet, too quiet for the city. No cars outside, no pipes creaking, just that strange, heavy silence that seems to have its own pulse. And under it, barely noticeable, came a sound. It was soft at first, almost like fabric shifting. Then something heavier. A drag. A dull, deliberate shift in the beams above me. I could feel the vibration through the mattress, a subtle tremor, as if something large and slow had just moved across the ceiling. I sat there frozen, my eyes locked on that bulge above my bed. I didn't move for minutes, maybe hours. I don't remember how long I waited before the breathing started. It came from inside the ceiling. It wasn't mechanical. It wasn't wind. It was wet, uneven, too human to dismiss. A long inhale that rasped through dust and insulation, followed by a trembling exhale that made the air in the room feel heavier. I could hear it shift, hear the wooden beams creak under a weight that shouldn't have been there. There shouldn't have been a crawl space up there. Not in this part of the building. My landlord told me it was all sealed off, no attic, no access. Just insulation, pipes, and wiring between the floors. But that sound, it was too close, too alive to be trapped air or vermin. That night, I didn't sleep. I couldn't. The breathing went on for hours, sometimes pausing as if listening for me. Sometimes scraping faintly, like fingertips brushing over plaster. When the sun finally rose, I convinced myself it had been a dream. Sleep deprivation, anxiety, something logical. But the bulge was still there, slightly lower. The paint cracked wider, a faint brown stain forming at the edge of it, like moisture seeping through. Only it didn't smell like water. It smelled like rot. Faint at first, but once you noticed it, you couldn't escape it. A sweet, nauseating decay that clung to everything. I pressed my hand to the ceiling, and it was soft. Spongy. Something was definitely behind it. I called maintenance. They promised to check it out. A man came by that afternoon with a ladder and a flashlight. I stood in the doorway, pretending not to watch his hands tremble as he pushed gently on the bulge. The plaster flexed under his fingers. Something thick moved underneath, like fluid trapped between layers. He muttered something I couldn't hear, then jabbed a screwdriver into it. The ceiling sank inward slightly, then rebounded. A dark, oily substance leaked out, dripping down his arm. He swore and climbed down, saying it was probably water mixed with insulation glue. But I saw his face when he caught the smell. He left, saying he'd come back tomorrow. He never did. That night, the breathing returned. Louder. Closer. It came in irregular bursts, sometimes fast, sometimes drawn out, almost like someone struggling to sleep. But there was no rhythm to it, no comfort. Just this endless cycle of wet inhales, slow exhalations, and the faint sound of shifting weight. The ceiling began to sag lower. Every night a little more. It started creaking whenever I walked under it. I could see the outline of something inside, uneven shapes pressing against the plaster. It wasn't consistent. Sometimes it looked like a shoulder, sometimes a head, sometimes nothing at all. I tried staying in the living room, but even there I could hear it. The faint movement. The soft, rhythmic breathing echoing through the vents. The smell of rot spread through the walls like invisible smoke. One night, I woke to a noise that didn't belong. A muffled thump, followed by a dragging sound, like something heavy sliding against the beams. My lamp flickered once, and in that half-second of dim light, I saw the ceiling dip sharply. The bulge pulsed, and then I heard a sigh. Not through the vents. Not above. Right over me. It was low and long, as though something exhaled inches from my face through layers of plaster and paint. The air grew cold. I could see my breath misting in the dark. Then the ceiling moved. It didn't just bulge, it shifted. The plaster stretched downward, forming a smooth, rounded shape that descended toward the bed. I could see dust falling around it, faint cracks splitting wider as it came lower, slow and steady, like a lung exhaling into my room. I couldn't move. Every instinct screamed to run, but my body refused to obey. From somewhere inside the ceiling came a sound I will never forget. A wet pop, then the faintest sound of something opening. A faint trickle of black fluid ran down the paint, dripping onto the sheets. The smell was unbearable, thick, metallic, like spoiled meat and damp soil. The breathing grew frantic, heavy, as if whatever was up there was panicking, or waking up. The plaster cracked open. A small fragment fell onto my pillow, leaving behind a thin hole. From it came the faint whistle of air, then a noise like a throat clearing, wet and guttural. I backed away slowly, heart pounding so hard I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. I could see through the hole now. Something was inside. Not a body, something worse. Something moving in ways a body shouldn't. I ran from the apartment that night, slept in my car until morning. When I returned, the ceiling had caved in. Chunks of plaster covered the floor, mixed with shredded insulation. But there was no sign of whatever had been inside. No water damage, no pipes, just a gaping cavity lined with black residue and a single, faint imprint in the dust-covered floorboards, like something had dragged itself out. I moved out the next day. The building manager said it was structural decay, old insulation collapsing. He replaced the ceiling, painted it over, and rented the unit again within a week. But sometimes late at night, I still hear it in my dreams, the slow, trembling breath from above, the sound of something shifting in the walls, patient and alive. And in those dreams, I always see that same ceiling, bulging down, stretching just enough to breathe. And it waits, because it knows I still listen. For months, the noise had been there. A soft tapping, then scratching, then something heavier, like the dragging of wood across plaster. At first, I thought it was pipes settling, or maybe a rat nest in the attic. But the thing is, there was no attic. Above my ceiling was nothing but a narrow crawl space. A thin, dusty void between my apartment's plaster and the old roof tiles. Just enough room for wires and insulation. Certainly not enough for something to move. And yet, something did. The sounds came mostly at night. Always around 2 or 3 in the morning, when the world outside was silent and my mind hovered between waking and dreams. It would start faintly, like the sound of fingernails raking fabric. Then a pause. Then another series of slow, deliberate scratches. Sometimes I'd hear what sounded like breathing, soft, shallow, uncertain. Like someone trying not to be heard. I'd lie frozen in bed, my eyes on the ceiling above me, tracing every imperfection in the plaster, waiting for the noise to stop. It never lasted long. Just enough to leave my pulse in my throat. Eventually, I started recording it. I wanted proof. But every time I played the recordings back, the sounds were gone. The static hissed. The room felt heavier, like the air itself had listened and remembered. Days turned into weeks, and I began noticing subtle changes around the apartment. Dust that fell from the ceiling in small gray flakes. A strange smell, damp, metallic, like rusting water pipes. Sometimes, when I came home from work, I'd find the light in the hallway flickering even though the bulb was new. Or my cat Miso would sit at the corner of the living room, eyes fixed upward, tail twitching. One night, I heard something that wasn't just scratching. It was dragging, slow and rhythmic, like someone pulling their body across wood. I sat up in bed, heart hammering, listening as the noise moved directly above me, then across the hallway, then into the kitchen. It was unmistakable now. Something was crawling above the ceiling. I stood beneath it, flashlight in hand, staring up. The beam hit the white paint, dull and uneven with age. I saw a slight bulge near the corner, subtle, like the ceiling was sagging from weight. When I stepped closer, the plaster creaked. The bulge quivered, then thumped. Something hit from the other side. Dust fell in a small cloud, drifting through the beam of light like snow. Miso hissed from behind me, tail puffed up. I didn't move. My mind screamed for logic, rats, raccoons, anything, but the heaviness of the thump didn't sound like an animal. It sounded like a hand. The landlord didn't believe me when I told him. He shrugged and said old buildings make noise. But when I insisted, he finally agreed to have someone check the ceiling. The following Saturday, 2 maintenance workers came by. They were both older men, casual in tone, confident this was just a rodent issue. One carried a utility knife, the other a pry bar. I stood in the corner, arms crossed, while they set up a small ladder beneath the bulge. The ceiling was dry but slightly soft when pressed. They exchanged a look, then started cutting. Thin white dust fell like ash. The smell hit first, sour, damp, like mildew mixed with something sweet and rotten. Then came the sound, something shifting inside. Something alive. The man with the knife froze, eyes darting to me. He pried a larger section open. Plaster cracked like old bones. And then, the ceiling sagged, split, and tore wide open. Something black and wet dropped through the hole and hit the floor with a heavy slap. For a moment, none of us moved. The smell filled the room, thick and nauseating. The thing on the floor wasn't moving anymore. It looked like a tangle of rags, but darker, glistening in the light. When one of the men crouched and pulled the fabric aside, a mass of hair slipped out. Human hair. The air left my lungs. Underneath that matted nest of filth was a skull. Small, misshapen, the jaw half gone. It was wrapped in what looked like an old blanket, rotted, eaten through by time. One of the men stumbled back, cursing under his breath. The other whispered that we needed to call the police. But before any of us could reach for a phone, the ceiling moved again. There was another sound above us. A scrape, a drag, then a faint exhale, so quiet, I thought I imagined it. But Miso bolted from the room, tail rigid, hissing wildly. I looked up through the hole. The flashlight beam shook in my hand as I aimed it inside. The crawl space was narrow and black, lined with insulation and rotting wood. And just at the far end, something shifted. The beam caught pale skin. A hand, thin, gray, trembling. It pulled back slowly into the dark. The worker closest to me muttered something and stepped down the ladder. His face was pale as chalk. "There's someone up there," he said. But it didn't sound like a question. The police came within the hour. They brought flashlights and masks, but even they seemed reluctant to go up there. 2 officers climbed into the crawl space while another stayed with me, notebook in hand, asking questions I barely heard. Then another thump. A shout. The officer froze mid-sentence. A minute later, one of the men above yelled down. There's more." What they found later filled the news. But I never read the articles. I didn't want to know the details. I only remember the smell, the mix of rot and dust that lingered for days. The police were in and out, bagging things I didn't look at. They removed the section of ceiling completely. I could see the black void now, the insulation shredded, streaked with something dark and dried. That night, I didn't sleep in my apartment. I went to a motel across town. But even there, lying in a bed that wasn't mine, I kept hearing it. The scratching, soft, rhythmic, just above my head. Maybe it was just in my mind. Maybe I'd been listening for it too long. But when I woke in the middle of the night, heart racing, I realized something. The noise wasn't above anymore. It was inside the walls. A week later, the landlord tore the ceiling out completely and sealed the crawl space. He told me, quietly, that the police believed the remains belonged to a homeless woman who'd gone missing nearly 2 years earlier. She'd been living up there somehow, crawling through the framework, stealing bits of food and water, nesting above tenants without anyone realizing. But they also found something else. A second set of prints. Smaller, closer to child-sized. The official report said they were inconclusive. But I saw the pictures before they took them away. They weren't prints from shoes. They were bare feet, long, narrow, with claw-like impressions at the tips. After I moved out, I still think about it. The weight above me. The soft dragging. Sometimes when I close my eyes, I imagine her lying just inches from where I slept, motionless, silent, waiting. And when I do sleep, I dream of the ceiling. How it bulged that night. How the dust fell like ash. How, when we tore it open, we didn't just find what made the noise. We freed it. It started with a sound. Not a loud one, not something that could be blamed on the wind, or the pipes, or the settling of the house. It was quiet, intentional, the kind of sound that only appears when everything else has gone still. The first night I heard it, I was half asleep on the couch. The TV had long gone dark, the screen reflecting the faint amber glow from a streetlight outside. It was late, past midnight, maybe closer to 3, that uneasy hour when the air feels heavier, when the corners of the room seem darker than they should be. That's when I heard it, a light, rhythmic scratching. Above me, not loud enough to be alarming, just deliberate, like something was trying to find its way through the ceiling, not digging, not gnawing, more like tracing. The sound of nails, slow and uncertain, brushing against wood. I remember holding my breath, my eyes fixed on the discolored spot where the ceiling met the corner above the couch. It didn't move much. The sound would start, stop, then start again, always in short bursts. When I finally moved, the sound stopped completely. I waited. Then it started again, but from a different spot, just above the hallway. That was the first time I noticed it could move. At first, I told myself it was a mouse or a squirrel that somehow got in through the attic. I even went up there the next morning with a flashlight, pushing through the heat and insulation dust, expecting to find droppings or nesting material. But there was nothing, not even a smell. The air was still and dry, untouched. That should have comforted me, but instead it left a pit in my stomach. Because the sound was still there the following night, and the next, and it was getting closer. When I moved to my bedroom, hoping the thicker walls and the white noise from a small fan would drown it out, the scratching followed. It began faintly at first, from somewhere in the ceiling near the vent. A thin, slow scrape that seemed to echo through the ductwork. Every time I shifted, it shifted too. If I turned toward the wall, the scratching came from that direction. If I rolled onto my back, it moved to the space directly above me. It wasn't random anymore, it was following me. It would stop completely whenever I got out of bed, then resume the moment I lay down again. For nights I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the house was expanding or contracting with the temperature. Maybe there was some kind of animal that could sense vibration and move toward it. I thought about rats, raccoons, even bats. Anything but the growing suspicion that whatever it was knew where I was. By the fourth night, the sound changed. It wasn't just scratching anymore. It started with a drag, like the edge of something sharp being pulled across the wood. Then a faint tapping, almost like fingers. Slow, patient, rhythmic. Scratch, scratch, tap, scratch. I stopped sleeping. Each night felt longer, as if time had slowed down. I would sit awake, eyes fixed on the ceiling, waiting for that first sound to begin again. It always did, around the same time, always when the world outside had gone silent. One night I decided to test it. I turned off all the lights, stepped quietly into the hallway, and waited in complete darkness. My skin prickled from the still air. The only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. Then scratch. It came from the living room, a long, dragging noise, moving from one corner to the next. I took one step forward. The scratching stopped. Another step, it started again, now from the hallway ceiling. It was following my movements. No matter which direction I went, it stayed just a few feet above me, crawling, dragging, shifting. I could almost map its path by the faint vibration of the plaster. That night I barely moved. I stood in the dark for what felt like hours, listening to it circle above me. Sometimes fast, sometimes slow, as if pacing. Sometimes it would stop completely for long stretches, and I'd think it was gone. But the moment I turned my head or took a breath too deep, it would resume. The next morning, I left the house. I went to stay at a friend's place for a night. Her apartment was quiet, normal, safe. For the first time in days, I slept soundly. No scratching, no sounds from above. When I got home the next afternoon, the house felt strange. The air was heavier, the smell different, stale, like wood soaked in moisture. I told myself I was just imagining it, but when night came, it returned. Only this time, it started immediately. The moment I stepped into the hallway, the scratching resumed. There was no hesitation, no pause. It was like it had been waiting. The sound tracked me through the kitchen, into the living room, even when I stood perfectly still. When I moved toward the front door, the scratching drifted across the ceiling toward it. When I backed away, it followed. I didn't sleep that night. I turned on every light, sat in the center of the living room with my back to the wall, and watched. Occasionally, I thought I saw the ceiling flex. Just slightly, the faintest movement, like something heavy pressing from above. Over the next few days, I noticed new things. The scratching grew louder, sharper. It wasn't faint anymore, it had weight. Sometimes it came with a creak, like the wooden beams were bending under pressure. And sometimes, late into the night, there would be a pause followed by a sound that made my skin crawl. Breathing. It was faint but real. A slow, uneven rhythm, dragging through the vents. I could smell something too. A faint, sour odor. Damp and old, like wet earth mixed with rot. It seemed to seep down from the corners of the ceiling, especially when the scratching was most active. By the end of the week, the noise began to descend. It no longer stayed above. Sometimes it would shift into the walls, soft, muffled scraping just behind the drywall. It would trace along the seams of the room, always staying close, always near where I was. I moved from room to room, trying to escape it. The bedroom, the living room, even the bathroom. But no matter where I went, the sound followed. It didn't just follow me from one room to another. It followed me through them. Once, while standing in the hallway, I pressed my ear to the wall to listen. I shouldn't have. The scratching stopped instantly. Then a single, sharp tap came from directly behind where my ear touched the plaster. I jumped back and didn't move again for a long time. I tried leaving again. I booked a motel across town, told myself I'd go back in the morning, and call someone pest control, a contractor, anyone. But that night, in the motel room, something woke me. It was faint, distant, but unmistakable. Scratch, scratch, tap. The sound was coming from the wall near the headboard. I stared at it, frozen, my breath caught in my throat. I knew that rhythm. I left before dawn. When I came home, I could feel it waiting. The air inside the house felt dense, as if it had absorbed all the noise from outside. I walked slowly through each room, half expecting to see claw marks or damage, but everything was intact. Ordinary. That night, I didn't turn off the lights. I sat in the center of the room again and waited. The scratching began, slow and deliberate, tracing the outline of the ceiling. I followed the sound with my eyes, watching as it moved above me, circling closer and closer, until it was directly overhead. Then the ceiling gave a faint, groaning sound. Like pressure. The plaster bulged downward, dust sprinkling from a fine crack that stretched across it. And beneath the surface, movement. Something was pushing against it. The air smelled of wet rot and iron. My stomach turned as the scratching grew frantic, faster, almost excited. Then silence. The bulge stilled. The smell lingered. I thought it was over, until I heard the first scratch, not from above this time, but from behind me, in the wall, right beside where I sat. I turned slowly, feeling the vibration through the floor. The sound moved from the wall to the baseboard, then across the floorboards. Crawling. When it reached my feet, I could feel it beneath me, faint tremors like the shifting of something hollow. It stayed there, right under me, motionless. I didn't move until sunrise. That morning, I packed what I could carry and left the house. I didn't sell it. I didn't call anyone. I just left. But even now, in this new place, miles away, sometimes at night, when everything is silent, I hear it again. Scratch. Scratch. Tap. Always faint. Always patient. And always moving closer. It began as something faint, just a distant, brittle sound behind the walls of my rented room. A soft scratching, barely audible, like the whisper of dry leaves brushing against wood. I had moved into the house 2 weeks before it started. It was a small place at the edge of town, the kind of home that seemed to sigh when you stepped inside. The ceilings were low, the wallpaper yellowed with age, and the air smelled faintly of dust and forgotten incense. The landlady said the last tenant was an old woman who'd lived there alone for years. She passed away quietly in her sleep. I didn't think much of it. People die all the time. But that smell, the faint sweetness mixed with something metallic, lingered in the walls like a memory that refused to leave. The scratching began on a Sunday night. I remember because I was trying to pray before bed. I wasn't a religious person, not really, but something about that house made me feel like I should be. The way the floorboards creaked in long, slow exhalations. The way the shadows from the streetlight outside seemed to shift along the walls, crawling like smoke. There was always a heaviness in the air, like the house was listening. I knelt beside my bed, closed my eyes, and whispered a few words. That was when I heard it for the first time, a light, uneven scratch coming from somewhere above the ceiling. It stopped the moment I did. When I opened my eyes, the room felt smaller somehow, as if the darkness had pressed itself closer around me. I tried to ignore it. Old houses make noises. Wood expands, rats scurry, wind finds its way through cracks. But the next night, when I tried to pray again, the sound returned. This time it came sooner, right as I clasped my hands together. The scratching was sharper, deliberate, like fingernails dragging against plaster. Every time I paused, it stopped. Every time I resumed praying, it started again. At first, I thought I was imagining it. Maybe the words of prayer were making me too aware of the silence around me. Maybe it was my own pulse in my ears. But the sound grew bolder over the days that followed. Louder, closer, and each time I prayed, the scratching intensified, as though something above me was responding, or listening. I started leaving the lights on at night. The bulb in that room gave off a weak amber glow that barely reached the corners, but it was better than complete darkness. Still, even with light, I could feel it, the house shifting, settling, breathing. The faint groan of beams above me, the slow crack of wood as if something moved just out of sight. The air smelled of old fabric and faint moisture, the scent of decay hidden behind plaster. One night, I tried something. I waited until midnight, sat on my bed, and whispered a single line of prayer. The scratching came immediately. This time it was furious, rapid, violent, right above me. I could almost picture it. Long, bony fingers dragging along the ceiling. The rhythm of it matched my heartbeat. And when I stopped speaking, it stopped too. The silence that followed was thicker than before. It had a weight to it, like the air before a storm. I didn't pray again that night. But as I tried to sleep, I realized something terrible. The scratching didn't need my prayers anymore. It began again on its own. Slow, steady, closer. It moved across the ceiling, from one corner to another, as if tracing the outline of my bed. Then it stopped directly above me. I lay there, holding my breath, afraid even to blink. The quiet stretched for a full minute, then came a soft tap. Another, and then the faintest sound, like breathing. Not mine. Something just above the plaster, inhaling in short, irregular gasps. That was the first night I didn't sleep. By the fourth day, I couldn't take it anymore. I borrowed a chair and flashlight and decided to check the attic. The access hatch was in the hallway, small and covered in dust. When I pushed it open, a foul smell poured down, something wet and stale, like rotting fabric left in the rain. I climbed up carefully, the wood groaning under my weight. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness in slow, trembling arcs. Dust floated in the air like ash. The attic was nearly empty, except for a few old boxes and what looked like a piece of torn cloth nailed to one of the beams. And yet, something was wrong with the ceiling itself. There were long, dark scratches in the wooden boards, stretching across nearly every surface. Some were shallow, others deep enough to splinter the wood. It looked like something had clawed at the underside, desperately trying to dig its way down. I followed the marks until I reached the space directly above my bedroom. There, the wood was cracked and warped inward, as if something had pressed its weight against it from above, over and over again. I thought I saw movement, a faint quiver in the wood, but the beam of my light shook too much to tell. The air grew heavier. My ears filled with a low hum, a sound too deep to be from wind or pipes. I felt it vibrating in my chest. I climbed down and sealed the hatch. I didn't look back. That night, I tried not to pray. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, hands trembling under the blanket. But the moment I thought of prayer, the instant I even considered it, the scratching began. It was softer this time, slower, but it felt aware, like it could sense my thoughts. Days turned into weeks. I barely slept. I stopped eating properly. The air in that room seemed to grow colder each night, even as I turned off the fan and shut the windows. I'd wake to find faint gray dust on my sheets, and once, thin flakes of paint that had fallen from the ceiling. Something was up there, something patient, waiting. I decided to leave the house. But each time I tried packing, the scratching started again, right above my head, as though following my movements. It grew angry when I touched the door, furious when I picked up my Bible. That night, I didn't dare move. The scratching didn't stop until morning. I started to notice other things, too. The mirrors fogged slightly even when it wasn't cold. Shadows didn't line up where they should. The corners of the room always seemed darker than the rest, even in daylight. And sometimes, when I closed my eyes, I could feel the faintest vibration through the mattress, like the heartbeat of something deep beneath the floorboards. One evening, exhaustion won. I found myself on my knees again beside the bed, whispering. I wasn't even sure what words came out. I just wanted peace. I wanted silence. But the scratching came violently this time, louder than ever before. The entire ceiling seemed to tremble. The light flickered once, twice, then went out completely. The darkness swallowed everything. The noise didn't stop. It circled the ceiling, darted from wall to wall, then dropped, sudden and heavy, onto the floor above me. I heard the boards creak as if something crawled across them. Slow, dragging movements. Then silence. And in that silence, breathing again. Closer now. The sound came from the wall behind me. Then the floor. Then right beside my ear. A faint scratch. A breath. And a whisper, not words, but the sound of something trying to imitate speech. I ran out of the room. I slept in my car that night, parked across the street. From there, I could see my bedroom window, the weak glow of the lamp still flickering inside. Around 3 a.m., the curtain shifted slightly, though no wind was blowing. Something moved behind it. I didn't go back inside until morning. When I finally gathered the courage to return, the scratching was gone. The air was still, the silence thick. I packed my belongings as quickly as I could, but when I reached the doorway, something caught my eye. On the wall, near where my bed had been, were faint marks, lines etched into the plaster. 5 of them, thin, deep. They trailed downward, stopping just above the floor, as if a hand had dragged itself down the wall. I left that house before sunset, but I wish I could tell you that was the end. That it stayed there, behind that rotting ceiling. It didn't. The first night in my new apartment, I unpacked my things carefully. The walls were clean, the floor new, the air dry and still. I felt safe for the first time in months. When I went to bed, I whispered a quiet prayer of thanks, just one line. And from somewhere behind the wall, a faint scratching answered. It hasn't stopped since. And every time I pray, it gets louder,